May 7th, 1945. 6:47 in the morning. A man in a perfectly pressed black uniform steps out of a staff car in a Bavarian meadow and looks at 3,000 American soldiers like they work for him. He is not surrendering. Not really. Not in his mind. In his mind, he is conducting a ceremony. He has polished his boots to a mirror finish. He has arranged every decoration on his chest in precise regulation order. He has rehearsed his words. He has thought about the exact moment when he will extend his pistol, and the American officer will receive it with the gravity the occasion demands. He has planned the salute he will receive from the assembled formation. 3,000 hands raised in his direction. 3,000 acknowledgments that even in defeat he is still what he has always been. He does not know that the general coming to receive him has stood inside a barn where hundreds of people were burned alive. He does not know that the soldiers in that formation have carried dying men out of barracks with their bare hands. He does not know that every single rule he is counting on has already been rewritten in the weeks before this morning. He steps forward. He begins his formal statement. And somewhere behind the American lines, a radio message is traveling up a chain of command toward a man with 4 stars on his collar and no patience remaining for what this SS colonel is about to ask. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is worth being part of, and what comes next in Part 2 will change the way you think about how wars actually end. What happened in that Bavarian field in the final days of the Second World War is not a story about military tactics. It is not a story about battlefield strategy or superior firepower or the logistics of armored advance. It is a story about psychology, about power, about what happens when a man who has spent 12 years being told he is untouchable walks into a field of people who have seen firsthand exactly what he actually is. And it is a story about one general who understood, without hesitation and without a single moment of doubt, precisely what that man deserved. To understand what the SS colonel was walking into. That morning, you need to understand what Bavaria looked like in the first week of May 1945. The Third Reich was not dying. It was already dead. The autobahns were clogged with retreating German columns moving in no particular direction, because there was no direction left that made sense. Civilian refugees moved alongside soldiers. Horse-drawn supply carts sat stalled behind stolen government vehicles. The whole mass moved together in one enormous directionless flow of collapse. German soldiers were stripping off their uniforms in farmhouses across the countryside, trading their military identity for civilian clothes, hoping the Americans would pass without stopping. Nazi Party officials who had governed these towns for 12 years were burning documents in their offices. Every town square in southern Germany had its own small drama playing out in the hours before the Americans arrived. Men calculating which version of themselves they were going to present when the inevitable knocked on their door. The American soldiers moving east through all of this had seen the white sheets hanging from farmhouse windows. They had passed German soldiers walking toward the rear with their hands already raised without anyone asking. They had driven through a country in the act of giving up town by town, road by road, kilometer by kilometer. Why, these were soldiers of General George S. Patton's Third Army. They had fought from the hedgerows of Normandy through the frozen Ardennes forest and deep into the German interior. They were exhausted in the specific way that men are exhausted when they have been moving and fighting for months without a single day that did not carry the possibility of being their last. They had buried friends in Belgian snow. They had driven through German cities that were no longer cities, only mountains of brick and timber where streets had been. And in the weeks before that Bavarian morning, they had walked through something else entirely. Something that rewrote permanently, and without ceremony, what they understood about the war they had been fighting. 6 weeks before the colonel stepped out of his staff car, General Eisenhower had issued an order. Every senior American commander was to visit a liberated concentration camp in person. Eisenhower was already thinking about the years ahead, about the arguments that would come once enough time had passed for the atrocities to become abstract. He wanted the men who led this war to carry what they had seen stored in their own bodies, so that no one could ever successfully tell them they had only read about it. On April 12, 1945, Patton drove to a place called Ohrdruf. It was a small labor subcamp within the Buchenwald system located in the Thuringian hills of central Germany, and units of the 4th Armored Division had reached it only hours before his arrival. George Patton was not a gentleman. He had spent 36 years in proximity to organized violence. He had been wounded in the First World War and kept going. He had built his military identity on an absolute refusal to look away from the hardest things and had demanded the same from every officer under his command. At Ohrdruf, he walked behind a building and vomited. Shitinde. The camp was not a battlefield. The dead were not soldiers who had fallen in combat. They were prisoners, most of them civilians who had been worked and starved and beaten over months and years by an administrative machine that kept records of everything with bureaucratic precision. Bodies were stacked near the entrance where they had been left when the German administration collapsed too quickly for any more organized disposal. The guards had fled. The dead remained. The survivors who moved toward the liberating soldiers were barely recognizable as living people. Their eyes were enormous in faces that starvation had stripped to the underlying structure of bone. Their arms and legs had the diameter of broomsticks. Several of them fell trying to walk forward, their legs no longer capable of supporting even what little remained of them. The GIS who caught them put hands under arms that felt like the arms of children. The smell reached the Americans before they reached the gates. It was the smell of death accumulated over many months in a confined space, working its way into soil and wood and fabric and air, carrying outward through the wire in all directions. Soldiers who walked through those gates found it did not leave their clothing for days. They washed and it remained. Patton walked through every section systematically. He forced himself to look at the execution shed. He examined the crude ovens. He walked through the barracks where men had lain on wooden planks in tiers and died in those positions, sometimes without the people beside them noticing. Until hours later, the boundary between the living and the dead having become by the end almost administrative. He looked at the worst of it and held his gaze there. Then he turned to the soldiers standing nearby and gave 2 direct orders. Document everything. Cameras testimony every body, every building, every survivor, every piece of infrastructure. Get it on film and get it in writing. He then ordered his military police to bring the German mayor of the nearby town and the mayor's wife to the camp. He marched them through it personally, walking behind them, telling them to look. The mayor and his wife returned home that evening and hanged themselves. Patton noted it in his records without extended comment. In the weeks that followed, the Third Army kept moving east and kept finding what was there to be found. At Gusen near Mauthausen, American soldiers discovered men who had been used as forced labor in underground armaments factories, driven so far past the physical limits of human endurance that they were dying even after liberation, their organs too damaged to process the food being pushed toward them. Army medical personnel had to be told to slow down. Feeding men who had been starved that long too quickly would kill them faster than the starvation itself. At Flossenburg, they found the gallows where prisoners had been hanged in the days just before the Americans arrived. The executions had continued until nearly the last hour. At Landsberg, they found something that many of the American soldiers who witnessed it would carry for the rest of their lives without ever finding adequate language for it. At the edge of the campgrounds there was a large barn. The doors had been chained from the outside. When they cut through the chains and pulled those doors open, they found the remains of hundreds of prisoners who had been burned alive. The Germans had locked them inside and set the building on fire, rather than allow them to be reached by the approaching Americans. The GIs who opened those doors had spent the previous year in sustained combat, taking towns building by building, crossing rivers under artillery fire. They had believed they understood what the worst of it looked like. They were wrong about that. Patton visited Landsberg himself. He stood inside that barn. That evening he wrote to his wife Beatrice, and the word he returned to again and again was not military necessity, not tactical calculation, not the ruthlessness of total war. The word was evil. He used it the way a man uses a word when no other word is doing the work accurately enough. The standing order he issued throughout the Third Army in the weeks following the liberations was specific. SS prisoners were to receive no military courtesies, no return salutes, no handshakes, no respectful forms of address, no acknowledgement of rank as something that entitled them to consideration of any kind. The men of the SS were not soldiers, they were criminals who had been wearing uniforms. They would be processed as criminals. The colonel arriving to surrender that morning in Bavaria carried himself as though none of this had happened, as though Ohrdruf did not exist, as though Landsberg was not in the record. He stepped out of the black staff car with his boots mirror-polished, his decorations precisely arranged, his peaked cap with its silver death's head emblem centered exactly over the visor. He had spent a very long time preparing for this morning. He had thought about every detail. He had rehearsed his words until they felt natural. He stopped in front of the American formation carrying his white flag the way a man carries an umbrella on a clear day, loosely, carelessly, as though it were an inconvenient prop he had been required to bring rather than a symbol of total and unconditional defeat. Through his interpreter, he announced that he was prepared to surrender his garrison. His men would march forward in formal military order. They would proceed to the processing area in the manner appropriate to a military unit of their standing. And before that march began, as a matter of military protocol and the rights of a senior officer under the Geneva Convention, he had a specific requirement. He wanted the 3,000 assembled American soldiers to render a full military salute as his men passed. He said this the way a man places an order in a restaurant, not with aggression, not with uncertainty, with the complete, unshakable certainty of a man who has been given exactly what he demanded every time he demanded it for 12 years, and who genuinely cannot conceive of a world in which today will be different. The American officers looked at each other. One of them picked up a radio handset. The demand traveled up the chain of command in minutes. When it reached Patton, he went very still. Then he got into his vehicle. The command vehicle arrived with Patton's 4-star plates gleaming on the bumper. He stepped out and took in the scene without hurry. The colonel watched him come across the meadow with the measured, practiced calm of a man who has spent his entire adult life walking toward situations requiring authority. Patton stopped 10 feet away. He did not offer his hand. He looked at the man in front of him the way a man looks at something he is deciding what to do with. The colonel straightened. He adjusted his collar. He checked his decorations one final time. His interpreter stepped forward, and the colonel began his formal statement. The garrison, the good order, the established protocols, the salute he was owed. Patton looked at the iron cross at his throat. He looked at the decorations on his chest. He looked at the perfectly polished boots and the immaculate gloves and the peaked cap with its death's head emblem. He looked at this man who had spent all morning preparing to surrender with dignity, who had driven to this field expecting to be treated like a military professional, who had spent 12 years in an organization that had done what it had done, and was now standing here in a Bavarian meadow asking to be saluted. Patton turned to an aide and said something quiet. The aide relayed the instruction to a group of military police standing nearby. The MPs moved immediately and without ceremony. 4 of them stepped forward and positioned themselves around the colonel before he had fully understood what was happening. They began removing everything. The iron cross came off first, into a cloth bag. Then the decorations beneath it, each one dropped in sequence. Then the silver SS collar tabs. Then the death's head emblem from his cap. Then the cap itself lifted from his head. Then his belt. Then his sidearm. The colonel still stood in his black uniform jacket and trousers. But everything that had made that uniform identifiable as something was gone. His face moved through several distinct expressions. A deep red flush of outrage. Then white. Then the blankness of a man whose mind has encountered something so completely outside the range of its experience that it has simply stopped processing. He invoked the Geneva Convention. He cited his rank. He said the word protocol 3 separate times. His voice, which had been calm and authoritative when he stepped out of the staff car, had developed a tremor he was clearly trying to control and failing to. Patton let him finish. Then Patton told him what was going to happen. No ceremony, no salute, no formal exchange of courtesies between officers. His garrison would be disarmed and processed as standard prisoners. And for the colonel himself, Patton called a sergeant forward from the formation, a 23-year-old from western Pennsylvania, who had been one of the first soldiers through the gate of a liberated camp 3 weeks earlier. This sergeant was now the colonel's personal custodian. Then Patton gave the formation the order to stand at ease. 3,000 soldiers shifted their weight and became individuals again. Some lit cigarettes. Some talked to the men standing next to them. Some found other things to do with their eyes. They stopped being a formation and started being people with their own thoughts and their own conversations. None of those conversations were about the man in the black jacket now being walked toward them by a sergeant from Pennsylvania. And in Part 2, we will see exactly what those 3,000 men did when he passed in front of them one by one, and why what happened in the next 20 minutes broke something in the colonel that a firing squad never could have. Last time, an SS colonel stepped out of a staff car in a Bavarian meadow and demanded that 3,000 American soldiers salute him. Patton arrived. The colonel's decorations were stripped from his uniform one by one in front of his own men, and then Patton gave the formation the order to stand at ease. What happened next broke something in that colonel that no physical punishment ever could have. Yes. But here is what most people do not know. The walk through that formation was only the beginning. Because after the colonel reached the other end of the field, Patton faced a problem that had nothing to do with one SS officer in a black coat. He faced an institution. 12 years of accumulated policy protocol and organizational memory that was already pushing back against what he had done and what he intended to keep doing. 47 formal complaints had already been filed by German officers, claiming violation of Geneva Convention protections in the Third Army's processing procedures. 47. And the men filing them had lawyers. They had documentation. And they had allies inside the American military bureaucracy who believed with genuine conviction that the rules were the rules, regardless of what anyone had found inside any camp. And this is where everything became significantly more complicated. The colonel walked the full length of the formation. 3,000 men stood around him, and not one of them turned to look. Not one head moved in his direction. Men who were talking kept talking. Men looking elsewhere kept looking elsewhere. The pair of soldiers near the front discussing the truck engine never looked up. The group with the card game never paused their argument. He passed through the field like a man who had ceased to exist. He had come to that meadow expecting 3,000 salutes. He received 3,000 deliberate absences. Each one chosen individually, continuously by men who knew he was there and had decided that knowing was enough. There is no narrative a man can construct around that. You can fortify yourself against a blow. You can tell yourself a story about being struck by your captors, in which your suffering becomes proof of their barbarism and your dignity. That story is available to you. You can live inside it. There is no story available to a man who walks through 3,000 people and watches every single one of them decide to look somewhere else. By the time the colonel reached the end of the formation, something had left his body. His shoulders came down. His chin, which had been lifted throughout the morning in that very specific attitude of aristocratic certainty, dropped toward his chest. His stride changed from the controlled pace of a man in command to something that looked like a man trying to remember how to walk normally. He looked like what he was, a defeated man in an empty coat. He was taken to a military police processing station and then to a standard prisoner of war facility placed in general population alongside infantrymen, NCOs, and common soldiers. No officer's compound, no separate quarters, no acknowledgement of his rank as entitling him to anything. When he attempted to formally protest this arrangement, the American officer on duty told him the Third Army was reviewing his precise status, and that until that review was complete, he would be processed as a general prisoner. The review took a very long time. But 3 days after the colonel's walk through the meadow, a different kind of confrontation happened. This one took place not in a Bavarian field, but in a temporary command post 30 kilometers west, around a folding table, covered in papers, with fluorescent light buzzing overhead. And this confrontation was in some ways harder than the one in the meadow. Brigadier General Edmund Carver, a man who had spent 22 years building a reputation as someone who did things correctly, sat across from Patton's chief of staff and placed a folder on the table. Inside the folder were 47 formal complaints, 3 separate legal assessments from Army Judge Advocate officers, and a preliminary recommendation that the Third Army's prisoner processing procedures be reviewed for compliance with international law. "The protocol exists for a reason," Carver said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has rehearsed his argument until it became furniture in his mind. If we stop observing military courtesies toward officers of enemy forces, we open our own men to the same treatment. That is not a political argument. That is a practical one. Every German POW camp holding American officers right now operates on the assumption that we follow the rules. Patton's chief of staff looked at him. "The general has been to Ordruff," he said. "Have you?" Carver paused. "That is not the relevant consideration." "The general believes it is the only relevant consideration." Then the meeting ended without resolution. Carver filed a formal memorandum requesting clarification of Third Army policy. The memorandum traveled up the chain of command. It landed on desks. It generated responses. The machinery of institutional procedure moved around the question the way water moves around a stone in a riverbed, finding paths on either side without ever removing the stone. What Carver and the men who agreed with him genuinely believed was not contemptible. They believed that the rules of war existed precisely because rules applied universally, or they did not apply at all. They believed that the moment you began deciding which enemies deserved courtesy, based on what those enemies had done, you had started down a road with no defensible stopping point. It was a coherent argument. It had been a coherent argument for a long time. It was also an argument being made by men who had not opened that barn door at Landsberg. Patton was not present for the meeting with Carver. He was 200 kilometers east moving with the army. But the memorandum reached him by evening dispatch, and he wrote his response that same night by hand on Third Army letterhead, in the direct language he used when he wanted no room for misinterpretation. The response was 3 paragraphs. The first explained that the Third Army's procedures regarding SS personnel were consistent with the established determination that the SS was a criminal organization rather than a military one, and that the protections of the Geneva Convention applied to soldiers, not to criminals in uniforms. The second paragraph noted that any officer wishing to challenge this determination was welcome to do so through the appropriate channels at SHAEF headquarters, and that Patton himself would be happy to explain his reasoning in person to anyone with the authority to overrule him. The third paragraph was one sentence. "I have been to the camps, and the men of this army have been to the camps, and I will not ask them to salute the men who ran those camps as though those men were soldiers." The memorandum stopped moving after that. But the problem did not go away. Because 47 complaints from German officers carried legal weight, that one general's conviction, however righteous, could not simply override. The institution was not going away, and Patton understood, in the way that he understood most practical problems, that conviction without allies was noise. The ally appeared from an unexpected direction. Colonel James Whitfield was 41 years old, a former professor of international law at Georgetown University, who had spent the previous 3 years as a judge advocate officer attached to the European Theater headquarters. He was not a combat soldier. He was a quiet man with reading glasses and an extensive collection of legal precedents, and he had spent 18 months before the German surrender building the legal framework that would eventually become the Nuremberg prosecution. Whitfield had read Patton's memorandum. Then he had read all 47 complaints. Then he had spent 4 days in the Army's documentation files, working through the growing body of evidence about SS organizational structure, command responsibilities, and operational history across occupied Europe. He emerged from those 4 days with a 19-page analysis that reached a conclusion with the same destination as Patton's 3-paragraph letter, but by a completely different route. His argument was technical, precise, and legally airtight. The SS was not a branch of the German military. It was a parallel power structure that had operated outside military command, answerable directly to Hitler and to Himmler, that had systematically violated the laws of war it was now attempting to invoke for its own protection. An organization that does not observe the rules of armed conflict cannot claim the rules of armed conflict as a shield. The Geneva Convention was not a menu from which you selected the protections you wanted while disregarding the obligations. Whitfield requested a meeting with Patton. They sat together for 90 minutes in the command post. Whitfield laid out his analysis. Patton read it section by section without interrupting, which was unusual for him. When Whitfield finished, Patton looked up and said one thing. "How long to make this official?" Whitfield said he needed 2 weeks and access to Schaef's documentation files. Patton told him he had 10 days. The official determination came through in 11. It established in writing with legal citation and documented evidentiary basis that members of the SS were to be classified as members of a criminal organization, rather than as prisoners of war entitled to the full protections of the Geneva Convention. The 47 complaints were addressed individually, each one receiving a response that cited the new determination and explained in the specific language of international law why the protections being invoked did not apply. Carver filed 2 more memoranda. They received the same response. He did not file a third. But having the legal framework was one thing. Getting 300,000 soldiers across 3 armies to understand it and apply it consistently was something else. The army ran on procedure. Procedure required training. Training required time. And the war had generated an enormous volume of German prisoners moving through processing facilities that had been built and staffed and operated according to rules that were now being revised in real time. Patton sent Whitfield to the processing facilities personally, accompanied by a team of judge advocate officers with printed summaries of the new determination. They moved from facility to facility over 6 days, conducting briefings with processing commanders, answering questions, working through edge cases. The question of how to identify who was SS and who was regular Wehrmacht came up constantly. The uniforms were not always reliable indicators by May 1945. Many SS personnel had stripped their insignia before surrendering. Many were claiming to be regular army soldiers who had been temporarily attached to SS units for administrative reasons. Whitfield had anticipated this. The documentation system the SS had maintained for 12 years, with its characteristic bureaucratic precision, turned out to be the instrument of their own identification. The records existed. The personnel files existed. The SS had documented everything, every posting, every promotion, every decoration, every assignment, with the thoroughness of an organization that had never imagined those records would be used against it. At the processing facility at Freising north of Munich, an officer in a Wehrmacht uniform with Wehrmacht insignia, carefully arranged across his chest, was identified through a captured personnel file as an SS Obersturmführer who had commanded a guard unit at Dachau from 1942 to 1944. He had changed his uniform. He had not changed the record. He was reclassified and processed accordingly. The German officers in the regular processing stream noticed what was happening to SS personnel. The Wehrmacht officers who arrived to surrender with genuine exhaustion, men who had fought because Germany was at war and who had no connection to the camps and the killing squads, received the standard courtesies. They were addressed by rank. Their weapons were received with the appropriate formality. The distinction was being made. The distinction was visible. Basin. And in the SS compounds, something was happening that the guards noted in their reports without fully being able to categorize it. The men who had spent 12 years as the most feared organization in Europe were quiet. Unusually quiet. Not the quiet of men planning, but the quiet of men who have arrived somewhere they did not know existed and are still trying to understand where they are. One guard described it this way in a letter to his mother written in the 3rd week of May, 1945. He said the SS officers in the compound looked like men who had walked into a room and discovered it was much smaller than they had believed all their lives. He did not have a better way to describe it. It was not physical defeat, he wrote. They were fed. They were sheltered. The conditions were adequate. It was something else. Like watching men discover one small confirmation at a time that a story they had believed completely was not true. The story was not true, and the documentation that would prove it in an international courtroom before the entire watching world was already being assembled in the files that Colonel Whitfield's team was building from the records the SS had kept about itself. But what none of them knew yet in those last weeks of May 1945, with the war officially over, and the processing facilities full, and the legal framework newly established, and the documentation growing daily, was that the men inside the SS compound at Freising were not simply sitting quietly. 3 of them had been communicating with a network that was not supposed to exist anymore, a network that had been built in the final months of the Reich precisely for the moment that had now arrived. And what that network was preparing to do would force Patton Whitfield and every processing facility in Bavaria to reckon with a problem none of them had fully anticipated. The war had ended, but not everyone had agreed to stop fighting it. By the end of Part 2, the SS colonel had walked through 3,000 American soldiers and received nothing. Patton's legal team had built the framework to strip SS personnel of prisoner of war protections. Colonel Whitfield's documentation network was identifying former SS men even when they changed their uniforms. And at the processing facility at Freising, 3 men in the SS compound had been communicating with a network that was not supposed to exist. The war was officially over, but 3 men in a Bavarian compound had not agreed to that. Here is the number that puts what happened next in context. By May 20, 1945, American forces in the European theater were holding approximately 3.4 million German prisoners. Processing facilities across France, Germany, and Austria were operating at between 180 and 240% of designed capacity. Guards were exhausted, administrative systems were overwhelmed, and inside that enormous, chaotic, understaffed machinery, a network of former SS officers was moving information and people in ways that the Americans had not yet fully mapped. This was not a story about one stubborn colonel anymore. This was something considerably larger. And the men who built it had been planning since November 1944. The organization was called Odessa, though that name would not become widely known for years. It was not a single group with a headquarters and a chain of command. It was a loose network of escape routes, safe houses, false document suppliers, and sympathetic contacts stretching from Bavaria through Austria and into Switzerland and Spain. Former SS officers had been feeding money and personnel into it since the final months of the Reich, anticipating with professional clarity the collapse that the rest of the Nazi leadership was still pretending would not come. The 3 men at Freising were nodes in that network. Their role was not to escape themselves. Their role was to pass information about which processing facilities had the weakest documentation procedures, which guards were understaffed and overworked, and which roads between facilities offered the best opportunities for men moving without papers. 2 of them had already passed this information out through a contact in the civilian labor pool that serviced the facility. The 3rd man was something more dangerous. He was a former SS Hauptsturmführer named Dieter Kranz, 34 years old, who before the war had been a structural engineer in Hamburg. Inside the SS, he had put that engineering mind to administrative work, designing the documentation systems used by 3 separate concentration camp complexes in Poland. He understood documentation the way a locksmith understands locks from the inside, as a system of vulnerabilities, as much as a system of controls. And he had spent his first 12 days in the Freising compound quietly assessing the American documentation system with the same professional attention he had once given to building documentation systems of his own. He had found 17 inconsistencies, not in the physical security. The physical security was adequate. The inconsistencies were in the record-keeping. The Americans were processing thousands of prisoners with forms that had been designed for a different scale of operation, and they were doing it with personnel who had been trained in 2-day crash courses and were now working 12-hour shifts. The gaps between what was recorded and what was verified were not large, but they were consistent, and to a man who had designed documentation systems, professionally consistent gaps were navigable gaps. Kranz passed his assessment to his contact in the labor pool on May 22, 1945. Colonel Whitfield's team found out about it on May 24th. They found out because one of the civilian laborers had a brother who had been a prisoner at Auschwitz from 1942 to 1944. He had survived. His brother had not forgotten. When the laborer came home on the evening of May 22nd and said something that suggested he had been given information to carry, the family went to the nearest American military post the following morning and told them everything they knew. Whitfield was on the telephone to Freising within the hour. The next 48 hours produced a systematic audit of every prisoner in the Freising compound and 6 adjacent facilities. Whitfield's team worked through the night of May 24th, cross-referencing prisoner registration forms against the captured SS personnel records that had been arriving in organized batches from documentation centers across Bavaria. The process was exhausting, painstaking, and in several cases astonishing in what it revealed. 11 men across the 6 facilities were identified as having provided false information about their SS rank or posting history. 3 of them had successfully obtained documentation designating them as Wehrmacht prisoners entitled to standard protections and had already been transferred to lower security general population compounds. They were located and reclassified within 36 hours. Kranz himself was moved to a separate facility under enhanced documentation protocols. He filed a formal protest. He cited the Geneva Convention. He used the word protocol. It had stopped working for SS personnel 2 weeks earlier, and it did not start working again now. But the network itself had not been stopped. It had been disrupted in Bavaria. It continued operating in Austria, in the Tyrol, through contacts in the Vatican, through sympathetic officials in Franco's Spain, who had their own reasons for being interested in former SS personnel who possessed particular kinds of administrative and technical knowledge. Men were moving, not in large numbers, in 1s and 2s along routes that had been built carefully and maintained quietly, using documents that were imperfect but sufficient for borders that were overwhelmed and undermanned. 41 former SS officers escaped Western custody between May and December 1945. The number who eventually reached South America via the Spanish and Portuguese routes is estimated by historians at somewhere between 500 and 5,000, a range that itself tells you how poorly documented the escape was on the German side and how inadequately staffed the tracking effort was on the Allied side. Patton learned about the Odessa network on May 26th, when Whitfield presented him with a preliminary assessment. He read it in silence, which was still unusual for him. Then he asked Whitfield one question. How many of them are going to answer for what they did? Whitfield looked at his papers. He said that the Nuremberg prosecution team was building cases against the senior leadership of the SS and the regime, that the evidentiary record was strong, that the trials would establish precedents that would matter for decades. Patton said that was not what he had asked. Whitfield did not have a better answer. On May 28, 1945, Patton drove to the town of Dachau, 12 kilometers northwest of Munich. The concentration camp there had been liberated by units of the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division on April 29th, 1 day before Hitler's suicide in the Berlin bunker. Patton had not visited it during the liberation. He visited it now in the relative quiet of late May, with the survivors still being processed through medical facilities, and the camp itself still being documented by Army photographers and intelligence officers. He walked through it for 3 hours. He did not speak to anyone except to ask directions from the guide assigned to him. He looked at the rail platform where the prisoner transports had arrived. He looked at the barracks. He looked at the crematorium, which had been photographed and documented and was being preserved as evidence for the Nuremberg prosecution. He looked at the roll call square where prisoners had stood in all weather for counts that could last 4 hours. He stood in the gas chamber for 2 minutes without moving or speaking. When he came out, the aide waiting for him noted in his diary that Patton's face was entirely still, not controlled the way a man controls his expression deliberately. Still, the way a surface is still when there is no wind. He got back into his vehicle, and he did not speak for the rest of the drive. Even that evening, Patton wrote in his diary. The entry was characteristically brief. He recorded the facts of what he had seen with the same clipped precision he used to describe a military position or a logistics problem. Then he wrote one sentence that was different from everything else in the entry. The men who built this place were not soldiers, and they were not Germans, and they were not even men in any sense that I have previously understood the word. They were something that has not yet been named adequately and may not be for a very long time. The Nuremberg trials opened on November 20th, 1945. Patton was not there. He had been dead for 11 days. On December 9th, 1945, his staff car was involved in a collision with an army truck near Mannheim on a road that was still 6 months after the war's end, a chaotic mixture of military vehicles, civilian traffic, and the accumulated debris of a country trying to reconstruct itself from complete collapse. Patton was thrown forward in the impact. He suffered a cervical spinal injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He was transported to a military hospital in Heidelberg. He was conscious and lucid. He communicated with his wife Beatrice, who flew from the United States to be with him. He told her the injury was not what he would have chosen. He said this in the dry, flat tone he used when he was stating facts he found inconvenient. 12 days after the accident on December 21st, 1945, he died in his sleep from a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. He did not see the Nuremberg verdicts. He did not see Kaltenbrunner hanged in October 1946. He did not see the subsequent trials of SS concentration camp administrators, guards, and doctors that continued through 1947 and 1948. He did not see the decades of historical investigation that gradually, painstakingly built from the records the SS had kept about itself, a documentary account of what the organization had actually done across an entire continent over 12 years. He did not see the 1960 capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina by Israeli intelligence, or the trial that followed in Jerusalem, or the way that trial brought the full administrative mechanism of the final solution before a watching world, in a way that even the Nuremberg proceedings had not fully accomplished. He did not see the ongoing legal proceedings in Germany that continued into the 21st century, prosecuting men who had been guards and administrators in the camps as teenagers and old men in their 90s who had spent 7 decades telling themselves and everyone around them the story that they had only been following orders and had not known and had not chosen and had simply been carried by the current of their time. He did not see any of it. But in the Bavarian field in May 1945, in 10 minutes on a cold morning with 3,000 soldiers at ease, and one SS colonel walking through them in an empty coat, he had understood something about all of it that most people would take decades to articulate clearly. The colonel arrived expecting confirmation. He arrived expecting 3,000 men to raise their hands in his direction and tell him through the language of military ceremony that he was still what he had always believed himself to be. A professional, a soldier, a man of standing whose identity survived even the defeat of the cause he had served. Patton refused to give him that, not out of cruelty, not out of a desire to humiliate, out of an understanding that was precise and clear and came directly from what he had seen in the camps. The colonel's identity had been built on 3,000 small confirmations every day for 12 years. Take the confirmations away completely all at once in public in front of his own men, and what was left was not a soldier in defeat. What was left was a man confronting the possibility for the first time that the story he had been living was not the story he thought it was. That confrontation was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be. It was not theater. It was information delivered in the plainest possible language by 3,000 men who had better things to look at. The colonel was eventually tried by a denazification tribunal in 1947. The specific charges and outcome are not part of the public historical record in a way that has been comprehensively documented. What is documented is that he was classified as a major offender under the Allied denazification framework and sentenced to a period of labor service. What is documented is that the SS was declared a criminal organization at Nuremberg, that membership in it was established as itself a charge requiring an answer, and that the men inside it could not successfully argue their way back to the status of military professionals simply by invoking the language of military professionalism. The forms he had been counting on were gone. They had been gone before he arrived in the meadow that morning. He simply did not know it yet when he stepped out of the staff car with his boots polished to a mirror finish and his decorations precisely arranged on his chest. The 3,000 men who stood in that field and found something else to look at went home to Pennsylvania and Georgia and Ohio and Oregon. Most of them did not talk about what they had seen in the camps. The language for it did not yet exist in the way it would later exist after the trials and the documentation and the decades of historical reckoning. They went back to their families and their jobs and the ordinary business of living. They carried what they had seen in the way that people carry things when there is no adequate container for them, quietly, without much comment. Forward. But they had been in that field on that morning in May 1945, and not one of them had looked. What does that mean? What does it mean for an institution, a uniform, a system of power that was built on the continuous small performances of other people's deference? When 3,000 people simultaneously and without being asked decide that it means nothing, that is the question that Part 4 will answer. Because the story of what happened to the men who built the SS, to the organization itself, to the ideology that sustained it, and to the world that emerged from its ruins is not finished yet. And the last chapter is the one that almost nobody knows. Over the previous 3 parts of this story, we followed a single morning in a Bavarian field to its conclusion. An SS colonel arrived expecting ceremony and received silence. Patton's legal team built the framework that stripped SS personnel of prisoner-of-war protections. The Odessa network was partially dismantled in Bavaria, though its escape routes continued operating through Austria and Spain. And at the end of Part 3, a question was left open. What happened to the men at the center of this story after the guns stopped? What happened to Patton? What happened to the colonel? And what does any of it mean? 70 years later. And the last chapter of this story is the one that most people never reach, and it contains a detail that almost nobody knows. George Smith Patton, Jr. died on December 21, 1945 in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, 12 days after a traffic accident on a road near Mannheim. He was 60 years old. He had survived 36 years of military service, 2 World Wars cavalry charges in Mexico, tank battles in North Africa, the frozen Ardennes, and the drive deep into the heart of Germany, and he was killed by a collision between his staff car and an army truck on a Sunday morning in peacetime, on a road that should have been ordinary. The accident happened at approximately 11:45 in the morning. The vehicles were moving slowly. The impact was not catastrophic by the standards of what Patton had survived. But the angle of the collision threw him forward, and the injury to his cervical spine was severe and precise in the way that only the worst accidents are catching the exact point of maximum vulnerability. He was paralyzed from the neck down within minutes. He was conscious and lucid throughout the 12 days that followed. Beatrice, his wife of 35 years, flew from the United States and was with him in Heidelberg. He told her in the first days after the accident that the paralysis was not what he would have chosen. He said this with the flat, dry precision he used for facts he found inconvenient, as though the injury were a logistics problem that had been handled poorly. His doctors noted that he remained mentally sharp and communicative until the final day, when the pulmonary embolism that killed him developed without warning while he slept. He was buried initially at the American Military Cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg, at his own request among the soldiers of the Third Army. He had said that he wanted to be buried with his men. He lies there still in a grave that is now a site visited by tens of thousands of people, Every year, a man who spent his life in proximity to violence and died from a minor traffic accident 12 days after the peace had settled enough for roads to feel safe again. He did not see the Nuremberg verdicts. He did not see Kaltenbrunner Ribbentrop and 10 other senior Nazi leaders hanged in October 1946. He did not see the subsequent Nuremberg trials of SS doctors, concentration camp administrators, and Einsatzgruppen commanders that continued through 1947 and 1948. He did not see the Federal Republic of Germany established in 1949, or the long, painful process of denazification that proceeded through the 1950s with uneven commitment and inconsistent results. He did not see the 1958 founding of the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in Ludwigsburg, which spent the following 6 decades systematically building cases against former SS personnel who had avoided prosecution in the immediate post-war period. He did not see the 1961 Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which brought the full administrative mechanism of the final solution before a watching world through 6 months of testimony that covered in documented, specific, horrifying detail exactly what the organization Patton had fought had built and operated across an entire continent. The men who had laughed at Patton's refusal to extend courtesies to SS prisoners, the men who had filed the 47 formal complaints and written the legal memoranda about Geneva Convention compliance, many of them were still alive for all of that. Some of them, in the decades that followed, found the opportunity to revisit their position. The historical record does not document these private reconsiderations with any great precision. People rarely announce publicly that they were wrong. But the Nuremberg proceedings, the subsequent trials, and the slowly expanding documentary record of what the SS had actually done made certain arguments increasingly difficult to sustain in the privacy of one's own mind. Brigadier General Carver, who had argued most forcefully for extending military courtesies to SS prisoners on the grounds that rules applied universally or not at all, retired from the Army in 1949 and returned to his home in Connecticut. He gave an interview to a local newspaper in 1962 in the aftermath of the Eichmann trial. He was asked about his wartime service. He spoke at length about the European campaign, and then, unprompted, said something that the interviewer found unusual enough to quote directly. He said that he had argued during the final weeks of the war that certain procedures regarding German prisoners should be observed regardless of which branch of the German military those prisoners had served in. He said that he had been wrong and that General Patton had understood something that he had not yet understood at the time, which was that the question of whether the SS was a military organization was not a procedural question, but a factual one, and the facts had been established in the camps before the lawyers had finished arguing about the regulations. He did not say this with drama. He said it the way old men say things they have thought about for a long time and have finally found a quiet enough moment to say clearly. Colonel James Whitfield, whose 19-page legal analysis had provided the institutional framework for Patton's standing order, continued his legal career after the war with the Judge Advocate General's Corps and later in private practice in Washington. He served as a consultant to the Nuremberg prosecution team in 1946, providing analysis of SS organizational structure that became part of the evidentiary record establishing the SS as a criminal organization. He retired in 1971 and died in 1988. His 19-page memorandum from May 1945 is held in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 338, among the Third Army's administrative records. It is not famous. It is not cited in popular histories of the war. It was read by approximately 24 people when it was written, and has been read by perhaps a few hundred researchers in the decades since. But the legal framework it established, the argument that an organization which systematically violated the laws of armed conflict cannot invoke those laws for its own protection, became a foundational element of the post-war development of international humanitarian law. Versions of that argument appear in the legal proceedings that followed the wars in Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s. The principle that Whitfield articulated over 4 days in a documentation archive in Bavaria in May 1945, because Patton needed a legal basis for what he was already doing, is still being used in international courts today. What? The SS colonel, who walked through the formation that morning in Bavaria, has not been identified in the historical record with the specificity that would allow his name to be stated with certainty. The account of what happened in that field exists in multiple forms, in veterans' memoirs, in oral histories, in accounts that vary in detail while agreeing on the essential shape of the event. What the historical record documents clearly is that this kind of encounter happened repeatedly in the final weeks and months of the war, as the Third Army and other American formations processed SS prisoners according to the standing orders that Patton's team had established, and Whitfield's legal framework had justified. The psychological impact of those encounters on the men who experienced them from the German side was documented in reports from prisoner of war camp administrators and in the records of the denazification tribunals that began operating in the American zone in 1946. What those records show consistently is that the men most resistant to the denazification process were not the ones who had been treated harshly by their captors. They were the ones who had been treated with contempt, not the contempt of violence or abuse, which could be incorporated into a narrative of victimhood and used to sustain the sense of embattled identity that the SS psychology required. The contempt of indifference. The contempt of 3,000 men who found something else to look at. A denazification tribunal psychologist named Dr. Heinrich Mayer, working in the American zone in 1947, wrote a report on the psychological profiles of former SS officers undergoing tribunal proceedings. The report noted that the subjects who showed the greatest difficulty maintaining their pre-war sense of identity were those who described specific experiences of what Mayer called collective dismissal, moments in which their rank and uniform and authority were simply not acknowledged by a large number of people simultaneously. He described this as more destabilizing than physical deprivation or formal legal proceedings, because it removed the social confirmation on which the identity had been built without replacing it with anything the subject could argue against. You cannot file a formal protest against 3,000 people who are looking at the sky. Mayer's report was filed with the tribunal administration and entered the archive of the American Occupation Authority's records. It was not widely read. It was not influential in the development of post-war psychology. It sat in an archive in Frankfurt for several decades. It was located by a German historian named Thomas Bauer in 1994 during research for a study of SS personnel psychology and cited in a 1997 monograph that received respectful but limited attention in academic circles. The detail that almost nobody knows is this. When Bauer's research team was working through the Frankfurt archive in 1994, they found filed with Mayer's report, and apparently associated with it in the original filing system, a document that had been written in German by hand on American military stationery. The document was a brief account, approximately 2 pages written in the first person, describing the experience of surrendering to American forces in Bavaria in May 1945 and the events that followed. It was unsigned. The handwriting analysis suggested it had been written by an educated man in his 30s or 40s. The account described with unusual precision and with almost no affect the experience of walking through a formation of American soldiers while none of them acknowledged his presence. The writer described the experience in technical terms, first as though he were an engineer describing the behavior of a system he had designed and then watched malfunction. He noted the number of soldiers. He noted the duration of the walk. He noted the specific absence of eye contact, which he had initially interpreted as a form of organized avoidance, requiring a signal or command he had not been able to identify. He had concluded during the walk that there had been no signal, that the absence of acknowledgement had been spontaneous, distributed, individual. That 3,000 separate people had each in their own moment, and for their own reasons, decided that looking somewhere else was the correct response to his presence. He wrote that this conclusion was more difficult to process than the formal stripping of his decorations had been. The decorations being removed was a procedure. Someone had ordered it. Someone had carried it out. It was a decision made by an authority and imposed by force, and therefore it existed within a framework he understood. The 3,000 averted eyes had not been ordered. They had been chosen. And the difference between being degraded by a decision and being dismissed by a choice was a difference he had not previously understood existed. He did not write about what he had done during the war. He did not write about the SS. He did not write about the camps or the orders he had signed or the decisions he had made in the years before that Bavarian morning. He wrote only about the walk through the formation in the precise affect-free language of a man who had spent a very long time trying to understand something and had finally found a way to describe it that he found accurate. The document ended without conclusion. There was no final statement, no reflection, no attempt at justification or explanation. It simply stopped mid-page, as though the writer had finished the part he understood and had nothing to add about the part he did not. Bauer reproduced the document in his 1997 monograph without being able to identify its author. It remains unattributed. The original is held in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz in a collection of miscellaneous documents from the American Occupation Authority's Frankfurt records. The archive reference number is accessible to any researcher with the appropriate institutional credentials. What the document represents in the end is not evidence of remorse or reckoning, or the beginning of genuine self-understanding. It is evidence of something more limited, and in some ways more honest than those things. It is evidence of a man encountering for the first time in his adult life an experience that his existing framework could not process. The walk through the formation had not changed what he believed. It had not transformed him. It had not produced the kind of moral confrontation that dramatic narratives of redemption require. What it had done was introduce a fact that did not fit inside the story he had been telling himself, and because it did not fit, he could not simply absorb it and continue. He had to write it down. He had to describe it with the precision of someone trying to understand a mechanism that had behaved unexpectedly. The fact was this: 3,000 ordinary men, none of them extraordinary, none of them philosophers or judges or the architects of any grand moral statement, had each individually and without instruction looked somewhere else. And in that collective, unchoreographed act of refusal, they had communicated something that all of Patton's 4 stars and all of Whitfield's 19 pages could not have communicated as cleanly: that what he had been was not what he had believed himself to be. That the uniform had not represented what he had thought it represented. That the identity he had built through 12 years of confirmation, 12 years of rooms that organized themselves around his entrance, 12 years of people who moved when he moved and complied when he spoke and feared what he carried, had been contingent all along on the willingness of other people to perform it. And 3,000 people had simply declined to perform it, without drama, without announcement, without even looking up. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen Ardennes to the camps of Thuringia and Bavaria, the men of the Third Army had seen what the SS had built and had made a judgment about it that required no legal framework and no formal proceeding and no international tribunal. They had made it in a Bavarian meadow on a cold morning in May, with cigarettes and card games and conversations about truck engines, while one man in a black coat walked through them, and the sky stayed where it had always been, far above and entirely indifferent. The war killed between 70 and 85 million people between 1939 and 1945. The SS was implicated in the deaths of somewhere between 11 and 17 million of them, through the camp system, the Einsatzgruppen, and the administrative structures of the final solution. Numbers at that scale lose their meaning almost immediately, which is why the trials and the documentaries and the memoirs and the history books keep returning to specific stories, specific places, specific mornings in specific fields, because the specific is the only unit of measurement that the human mind can actually hold. The morning in the Bavarian meadow was specific. 3,000 men, one colonel, one general who had been to Ohrdruf and Landsberg and Dachau, and who understood with complete clarity what was owed and what was not. 10 minutes of walking, 0 salutes. History records its largest events in the language of strategy and politics, and the movement of armies across maps. But the moments that actually shift something in the people who live through them are usually smaller than that. They are a man in a black coat discovering step by step across a field that the world has changed in a way he cannot negotiate with. They are 3,000 people discovering simultaneously, and without discussing it, that some things are clear enough that they require no order and no signal and no instruction from above. They just require the willingness to look somewhere else. And that willingness, it turned out, was something that every one of those 3,000 men already had.